The voicemail came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning while I was sitting in a hotel conference room in Phoenix, pretending to pay attention to a slide deck about Q3 projections. My phone buzzed face down on the table. I ignored it. Then it buzzed again, and again. When the fourth notification hit in under 2 minutes, I flipped it over. 4 texts from my neighbor Linda. No words, just photos. I excused myself so quietly that I don't think anyone noticed me leave. I walked to the end of the hallway, past the ice machine, and I stood there looking at my phone with my back against the wall. The first photo was taken from across the fence. A truck I didn't recognize parked in my driveway. The second showed 2 men in hard hats, standing near the back gate. The third was the one that made my knees go soft. The fourth was worse. I called Linda before I'd even finished looking at it. She answered before it rang twice. "Diane, I am so sorry. I tried to get them to stop. I told them I was calling the police. The man in charge showed me a work order and said the property owner had authorized everything. I didn't know what to do. I have it all on my security camera. All of it. My pottery studio. Gone. My kiln, my wheel, my mother's hand-painted sign above the door that said, 'Make something beautiful.' The structure my mother and I had spent 8 weekends building the summer before her diagnosis. Before everything changed. Where's my husband?" I asked. My voice didn't sound like mine. He left about an hour before they arrived. I saw his car go. I hung up and called my husband. He answered on the first ring, which told me everything. "Diane. Listen. Where are you?" "I'm at my brother's. He called me this morning and said he'd already handled it. He said he was doing us a favor. That you spend every weekend in that shed, instead of, he demolished my studio. David. He said it was a safety hazard. The electrical wasn't up to code. He was just trying to help." I didn't say another word. I ended the call, walked back into the conference room, told my manager there was a family emergency, and booked the next flight home. 3 hours in the Phoenix airport, 2 hours in the air. The entire time, I sat with my phone in my lap, reading the texts my brother-in-law had sent my husband that morning. My husband had forwarded them to me without comment. I still don't know why. Maybe guilt. Maybe he wanted me to understand. What I understood was this. My brother-in-law had woken up that morning, hired a demolition crew, driven to my property without telling me, and watched my studio come down with a cup of coffee in his hand. His text to my husband read, "Took care of the she-shed situation. You can thank me later. Women who hide from their families in craft rooms need a reason to come back inside." My brother-in-law had never liked me. That was the plainest way to put it. He was 12 years older than my husband, the kind of man who had opinions about everything and facts about nothing. He called my pottery playing with mud. He called my studio the escape hatch. At Thanksgiving 2 years ago, he told the table that women who needed hobbies were really just women who needed to try harder at being wives. My mother-in-law had laughed like it was a joke. I had smiled because it was a holiday, and my mother was still alive and I didn't want to ruin the meal. My mother had been a ceramicist her whole life. Not professionally, not in any way that paid the bills, but seriously. Her hands knew clay the way some people's hands know piano keys. She taught me when I was 7, standing behind me at her wheel, guiding my palms against the wet spin of it. After my father died, the studio she kept in the garage became the place she went to remember how to breathe. When she was diagnosed, when the treatment started, and her hands shook too badly to center clay, she would still sit in there. Just sit. She said, the smell of it kept her calm. The summer before she died, during a stretch of months, when her energy came and went unpredictably, she told me she wanted to help me build my own studio. Not a garage conversion, a real structure, planned and built from the ground up. She drew plans on graph paper. She picked out the windows, insisted on the northern light. We poured the foundation on a Saturday in June with 3 of her friends helping, all of them in their 60s. All of them laughing and arguing about the best way to level concrete. I have a photo from that day. My mother is wearing a wide-brimmed hat and rubber boots, and she is laughing at something off camera. And the light is exactly the way she said it would be from the north. She died 14 months later. The studio was the last thing we made together. Linda met me in my driveway when I got home. She didn't hug me, which was the right call, because I was not in a place where I could be hugged without breaking entirely. She handed me her laptop and showed me the footage without saying anything. The timestamp read 9:14 a.m. My brother-in-law's truck pulling up. Two men climbing out of a separate vehicle. My brother-in-law walking to the back gate, unlocking it with a key, which meant he had gotten a copy of my key at some point. From somewhere, pointing at the studio like he was giving a tour. Signing a clipboard. The small excavator arriving 40 minutes later. The whole structure came down in under an hour. The kiln was still inside. My mother's wheel, the one she had given me when she moved into assisted living. The one with her initials scratched into the base because she scratched her initials into everything she loved. My tools, 3 years of finished work I hadn't yet listed in my shop. The crate of my mother's glazes that she had mixed herself, colors she had named after places. Sedona red, Oregon moss. The pale blue-gray, she called simply November. 41 minutes to destroy 12 years of my life and everything that remained of hers. My attorney was a woman named Patricia, who had been my college roommate and was now the sharpest person I knew. I called her before I even went inside the house. She picked up on the third ring, and I heard the shift in her voice, the moment I started talking. That particular focus that meant she had already started thinking 3 moves ahead. "Tell me the property situation," she said. "The studio was on my lot, my property, my name on the deed, fully permitted. My husband and I have separate property agreements. He has no ownership interest in the studio or the land it sits on. And your brother-in-law has no ownership interest either. None. Zero. Do you have documentation of the permits? Every permit, every inspection certificate, every correspondence with the county. It's all in a folder in my filing cabinet." I paused. "Which is inside the rubble. The documents will be in county records. We'll pull them. Linda has footage, full footage, arrival, demolition, everything. Don't move anything. Don't post anything. I'll be there in 45 minutes. I sat on my back steps and looked at the concrete slab. The excavator had cracked it in 2 places. The wood we had carefully selected, dried, and treated was scattered in splinters. The north-facing windows my mother had chosen were shards. Somewhere in the debris was the hand-painted sign. I couldn't see it. I didn't look too hard. Patricia arrived with a yellow legal pad and a recorder, and the kind of calm efficiency that I had always found more comforting than sympathy. She walked the perimeter, took her own photos, interviewed Linda with her recorder running, and reviewed the demolition company's paperwork, which Linda had photographed on her phone when the crew arrived. "He signed as property owner," Patricia said, reading from the photo. "He used his name and your address. That's fraud. He also noted on the work order that the structure had been condemned by the county as a hazard, which is a false statement, filing a false report. And he used a key to access your property without permission, which is criminal trespass preceding the destruction." She looked up. "This isn't a civil dispute, Diane. This is criminal. What does that mean for me?" "It means we file a police report tonight, and tomorrow we start calculating what everything was worth." That second part was the one that undid me, because how do you calculate what something was worth when part of what it was worth was never going to appear on any appraisal document? The kiln, $11,000, nearly new. My wheel, $3,000. My mother's wheel, no current market equivalent for the specific emotional function it served. The raw materials, the finished inventory, the studio structure itself, built to spec with commercial-grade insulation and custom millwork. $42,000 to replace. My mother's glaze collection, which could be partially recreated by a ceramicist who knew what she was doing, but not entirely. The woman who had named those colors was gone. Patricia was patient with my list. She wrote down everything I gave her and did not tell me what could and couldn't be claimed. "Not yet," she said. "Write it all down. Every item. We'll figure out the numbers later. What matters right now is that you remember everything." The police came at 8 o'clock. 2 officers, one of whom a woman about my mother's age when she died, took the report with an expression that went from neutral to something else as the story unfolded. When I finished, she asked, "Your brother-in-law, has he done things like this before?" "Property-related, boundary-related. He broke a padlock on my storage unit 2 years ago because he wanted to borrow my husband's camping equipment. He said it was a family property issue." She and her partner exchanged a look. "We'll pay him a visit tonight." My husband came home after the officers left. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me, and I could see him running calculations about what to say and how to say it. I saved him the trouble. Did you know he was planning this? No. I swear to you, I didn't know. He texted me after. Did you know he had a key to the back gate? A pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. He borrowed it once, last spring. I forgot to ask for it back. You forgot. Diane. My mother's wheel was in there, David. He sat down at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands. To his credit, he did not defend his brother that night. He did not try to explain or contextualize or suggest that maybe there was a way to see the other side. He just sat there, and eventually he said, "Tell me what you need me to do. Stay out of Patricia's way, and don't talk to your brother without telling me first." He nodded. He slept in the guest room. I didn't sleep at all. My brother-in-law was not arrested that night. The officers spoke with him, documented the conversation, and the case was referred to the detective unit the following morning. I know what he said because one of his friends posted about it on Facebook that same evening, seemingly without understanding that public posts are discoverable. Apparently, my brother-in-law had told the officers he'd done our family a favor, that I used the studio to avoid domestic responsibilities, that the structure had been an eyesore and a hazard, and that his brother would thank him eventually. The friend's post included a quote, "Sometimes the people who love you have to make the hard calls you won't make for yourself." The comments on that post were not what his friend had anticipated. Several people who knew our family, who had been to my studio, who had heard me talk about my mother, responded in ways that were not supportive. One woman who had taken a workshop with me wrote 3 paragraphs about my mother, about the day she came to watch a class and sat in the corner and watched everyone work with an expression of such quiet pride that half the class had teared up. My brother-in-law deleted his account within 48 hours, but Patricia had already screenshotted everything. He also, in the 36 hours before he understood the scope of what he'd done, texted my husband 3 times. The texts were a progression. The first said, "She'll get over it, trust me." The second, sent after the police visit, said, "This is ridiculous. It's just a pottery shed. David, you need to get control of your wife." The third, sent the following morning after Patricia had already filed the civil suit, said, "I think I need a lawyer." The criminal case built slowly. Fraud. Filing a false report. Criminal destruction of property valued over $10,000, which was a felony in our state. Criminal trespass. His attorney, an overconfident man who had clearly not yet reviewed the footage, initially argued that this was a family matter, that my brother-in-law had genuinely believed he had authorization, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding born of familial concern. Patricia put the footage in front of the DA on day 3. There was no misunderstanding visible in that footage. There was a man who knew exactly what he was doing and was comfortable enough doing it that he had brought coffee. The civil case was where Patricia was truly in her element. She built the damages the way my mother used to build a glaze layer by layer, each one deliberate, each one adding depth. Structural replacement value, $42,000. Equipment and tools, $18,000. Inventory loss, documented through my shop's records, $9,000. My mother's wheel, appraised with the help of an estate specialist who understood ceramics history, $8,000, with a written note in the appraisal that the emotional and provenance value could not be quantified. My mother's glaze collection, assessed by a ceramicist colleague of mine who had worked with her, $4,000 for the materials, with a separate line noting that the proprietary formulas were not recoverable. Emotional distress, $45,000. Loss of business income during reconstruction period, $20,000. Punitive damages, $80,000. At mediation, his lawyer argued the total down aggressively. My brother-in-law sat across the table from me for the first time since he had demolished my life, and he looked at me with an expression I had not expected. Not remorse. Not even defiance. Exactly. Something closer to genuine bewilderment. Like he could not understand why mud and a shed and a dead woman's pottery wheel had become this large, this expensive, this consequential. "It's just ceramics," he said at one point, to his lawyer but loud enough for the table to hear. Patricia put down her pen very slowly. She did not look at him. She addressed the mediator. "My client would like the record to reflect that the structure in question was built by my client and her late mother during the final healthy months of her mother's life. That her mother died 14 months after construction was completed. That the studio contained irreplaceable tools given to my client by her mother before her death. That my client was out of state on a work trip when the destruction occurred, and therefore had no opportunity to intervene. She picked up her pen again. It was not just ceramics. He was quiet after that. His homeowner's insurance had already denied coverage when they learned the destruction had been committed intentionally and fraudulently. His business, a contractor operation, which made the whole thing even more bleakly ironic, was hemorrhaging clients. The criminal charges were still pending. His attorney whispered in his ear for 4 solid minutes. We settled for $210,000. Patricia had advised me to take it. He's going to try to file for bankruptcy protection, she said. If you hold out for the full judgment and he files before we collect, you get nothing. 210 now is better than 240,000 on paper and 0 in your hand. I took it. The criminal case resulted in a plea agreement. Felony criminal destruction of property, reduced to a misdemeanor with 3 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and a formal restitution order attached to the civil settlement. No jail time, which I was not happy about. Patricia told me the DA had done what the evidence and the plea guidelines supported, that the system rarely gave people what felt fair, and that watching him lose his business, his savings, and his dignity in front of everyone who had ever respected him was a form of accountability, even if it wasn't the one I would have written for him. His wife left him 6 weeks after the plea. She came to see me once, alone, and she sat at my kitchen table and told me she was sorry. She said the studio was the last of a long list. She said she had watched him treat the women in his life like problems to be managed for years, and that she had told herself it wasn't her place to intervene in his relationship with mine. She said she would regret that for a long time. I appreciated her honesty. I did not tell her it was fine, because it wasn't, but I told her she didn't owe me anything. She nodded and left, and I stood at my kitchen window for a while watching the empty slab where my studio had been. I broke ground on the new studio in the spring. David helped. This time, I didn't work in 8 weekend bursts. I worked every weekend for 4 months, and David was there most of them, learning to use tools he'd never picked up before, asking questions and making mistakes and learning to sand along the grain. His brother had accused him of failing to manage his wife. What he was actually doing was learning to build something with her, which is a completely different skill and a much harder one to master. The new studio is bigger, better insulated. I splurged on the kiln because the settlement made it possible. I found a vintage pottery wheel at an estate sale that had belonged to a ceramicist in Vermont, and though it isn't my mother's wheel and doesn't carry her initials, there is something in the way it runs smooth and slightly idiosyncratic that I find comforting in a way I didn't expect. I didn't mount a copy of my mother's sign, the hand-painted one. That one was hers, specific to her, and it belonged to the studio she helped build. This studio needed its own words. I carved them myself, into a piece of walnut. David cut and joined. Rebuilt, with love and time. Not as lyrical as hers was, but honest. There is one thing in the new studio that came from the old one. When the debris was cleared, I hired a salvage company, not a demolition crew. They found my mother's glazed journal under what had been the storage shelving. The cover was damaged, the edges black, but the interior pages were intact. All her formulas, all her color notes, written in her looping cursive with small sketches in the margins. Oregon moss, manganese, cobalt, a note that said adjust for high-altitude firing. November, the one she never quite got right until her last year, and then got exactly right, and the note next to it said simply finally. I held that journal in the parking lot of the salvage yard, and I did not cry, not right then. I drove home and put it on the shelf in my new studio, under the new windows that face north. The way she taught me, because northern light is honest, and you need honest light to see what you're making clearly. My brother-in-law sent a letter 4 months ago. It arrived in a plain envelope with his return address in a city 3 states away. He had moved, apparently after the business folded and the house was sold to cover the settlement. The letter was not an apology. It was an explanation of circumstances, a listing of the ways things had not gone the way he intended. A quiet catalog of losses offered in a tone that seemed to expect acknowledgement. He wrote that he had not understood what the studio meant to me. He wrote that he hoped, in time, I would be able to move forward. He wrote that he missed his brother. I showed it to David. He read it twice, quietly, and then set it on the table. Do you want to respond? He asked. No. He nodded once. We didn't discuss it further. That evening, I had my niece in the studio, my sister's daughter, Cassie, who is 9 and has been asking to learn to use the wheel for 2 years. I finally said yes in January, and she comes every other Saturday now. She is patient in the specific way that children are sometimes patient with things they love deeply, which is to say she will try the same motion 40 times without complaint if she thinks she's getting closer. We were centering clay, her hands inside mine the way my mother's hands were always around mine when I was learning. And she asked me why the studio smelled different from the rest of the house. Clay has its own smell, I told her. Earthy. A little mineral. Some people say it smells like rain on dry ground. I like it, she said. Your great-grandmother would have liked you. She would have said you have good hands for this. Cassie looked down at her hands, which were covered to the wrists in gray slip, and considered this information with the seriousness it deserved. Did she teach you? She taught me everything I know. Are you teaching me everything you know? I'm teaching you what you're ready for, I said. The rest comes later. She thought about that for a moment, and then she pushed her weight forward slightly the way I'd shown her, and the clay, which had been wobbling, steadied on the wheel and began to find its center. People ask me sometimes, when the story comes up, whether I regret not going harder, whether I should have pushed for the maximum judgment instead of settling, whether the amount was enough to compensate for what I lost. And I understand the question, the logic of it, the desire to believe that the right number exists, that if you land on it, the scale balances. But here's what I've learned about making things. The value isn't in the object. The object is just the record of the time, and the attention, and the care. My mother's wheel is gone, and I can't get it back. Her sign is gone. The studio she helped me build is gone. What my brother-in-law could not demolish because it lives in my hands, and in the hands I am now teaching. Because it is written in a water-stained journal on my shelf, because it is present every time I center clay and feel the particular patience she taught me settle into my shoulders. None of that was ever in the building. He brought a crew and a machine and a great deal of confidence about what mattered and what didn't. He was wrong about almost everything, but he was most wrong about that you can take something from a person by destroying the place where they kept it. The clay doesn't know the difference between the old studio and the new one. It only knows the hands.